Jojo's Bizarre Adventure. Golden Heart, Golden Ring. Capitolo Set. Joy Division. Hexagons, triangles, squares. The geometric shapes into which are cut the stones of the basilicas are incredibly diverse. It would suffice only that multicolour mosaic to satisfy the eyes of the tourists who entered there. Instead, even the walls are all covered with spectacular mosaics. There's the one that portrays the Doge Vital Falier with the relics of San Marco, the seduction of Herode by the beautiful Salome, the triumphant entry of Christ in Jerusalem. Stories from various periods and depicted in various epochs, but every one of them majestic and splendid. And if you run your gaze high above, along the columns describing ample arches towards the ceiling, it's then that beyond your eyes opens the cupola, with the representation of the Assumption of Christ in heaven. There are 4 angels that shine in the darkness. Between them, Christ, with open arms, who rises upwards. At his feet, the Virgin with the 12 apostles. The faint moonlight that filtered through the small skylight breathed life into this spectacle of the grandiose panorama. The massive cathedral of San Marco, the pride of Venice. In that moment, it was completely empty. There were none of the tourists, none of the devoted who usually were never lacking. In their place was a shadow so big as to veil the gold of the Assumption of Christ that shone in the darkness. It was a gigantic white creature from which emanated a strange stench. Both his anterior paws were stretched out forward and had 3 long claws each, 6 in total, amid which one could catch a glimpse of the snout. From the mouth, which widened open like a broad cut through the snout, alongside a thick yellowish saliva that dripped non-stop onto the ground, came a stench enough to cause retching from nausea, exhaled in noisy puffs that resembled those of a piston. The ears, already originally big, were before they were pink now, had assumed a dirty orange hue, and, together with the colossal tail stretched backwards and stiff, vibrated harshly. The little gems that it had on the forehead and the back of the front paws shone in a blood-red colour, so much that the light they released, blood-red as well, spread around an almost evil atmosphere. "You've arrived just in time, Fugo," said the short man, wrapped up in his rubber suit, to the boy with blonde hair. The boy, without even bothering to answer him, continued to watch the huge monster that stood before him. "Now all we can do is wait for the enemy's arrival." The man's voice came faint and distorted, since he had his face almost entirely covered by the rubber. "I think it's best not to cry victory until the end, Sogliola." "Is that so? You think those guys even have a chance of beating this monster?" "Even the hitman you called in to eliminate them, that Rigatoni, in the end was unable to defeat Buccellati's team." At those words, the man in the rubber suit pulled a face in annoyance. "I didn't certainly think he'd be able to eliminate Buccellati and his gang all alone. After all, he managed to incapacitate 3 out of 5 of them. I think it's a good result. After all, isn't it often said that victory is a matter of good fortune?" "Fortune? It's obvious that you're a gambler, sir." At Fugo's irreverent words, the man started to get nervous. "I only play to win!" At that line, Fugo couldn't hold back. For the first time, he addressed the man that was to his side by looking him straight in the face. "You, sir, are you really convinced you won't lose?" The man in the rubber suit was the orchestrator of everything that had happened until that moment, Sogliola Lopez in person. He was covered from the tip of his hair to the tips of his toenails in a rubber outfit, tight and elastic, which reminded that of a scuba diver underwater, or some strange fetishistic outfit. But Sogliola wasn't dressed that way as a joke, and the carnival was still far. That rubber outfit was indispensable to allow staying in that place at that moment. Out of the huge monster that had placed itself in the centre of San Marco's cathedral, what in its entirety stood out the most was, more than anything, the eyes. One was red, as if suffering a hemorrhage, the other a golden yellow from which shone an opaque light. In the middle of its pupils burnt a purple-coloured flame. Those eyes which were so full of evil that just looking directly into them would cause dizziness stared vacantly, without looking at anything in particular. That monster was the Cure. That stand that used to roll placidly on Coniglio's lap had escaped to control and had completely gone mad. The power of the Cure was to absorb the evil and the suffering of men, but all the pain it absorbed had to end up somewhere, and it wasn't plausible that it dispersed in the air to end up in the bright blue sky. The pain and suffering it absorbed accumulated inside it. Like the mud that settles in the bottom of a pond, it had developed a multi-layered vortex of suffering. Normally, the accumulation would have been released during Coniglio's everyday life. Instead, because of the incident, the Cure had gotten enlarged from the excess of pain it had absorbed, a quantity so high to surpass what it could tolerate. After all, it meant that Coniglio's suffering had also gotten bigger and overburdening. Because of all those dead she'd found herself in front of, her nerves had been worn out past the limit, and in the end, in front of that burning house, the thread had been broken. In that moment, the only thing Coniglio had desired was to be relieved of the suffering. All the pain that had been inflated like one of those amusement park balloons had suddenly flown away, spreading through all of Venice. And her stand, the Cure, had continued to get bigger. It had walked triumphantly all around Venice, spreading Purple Haze's virus. The concentration of the virus was even higher than that initially spread by Fugo's stand. After the passage of the Cure, people continued to feel ill and die amid atrocious laments. The families that had been interrupted in their routine by the sudden lack of light, the numerous tourists that had gathered in that place to enjoy their short holiday. Without Coniglio's control, the Cure had continued to advance tirelessly, letting itself be guided by instinct, and while roaming, it continued to spread that lethal virus. On its large back it brought along the girl unconscious. The Cure didn't have a precise objective, while it roamed the city streets as a plague spreader. It had been the sound of the bell that guided him, leveraging on its instinct. Obviously, that sound was also a means to have Buccellati and his companions get closer and fall into the trap. The plan had been put into action according to Sogliola's detailed calculations and the instructions he had given. Without directly getting his hands dirty, he had brought it onward slowly but steadily, as if slowly executing the enemy with a silk cord around the neck, soft at first and deadly afterwards. You could even say it was a plan befitting of that Sogliola, who with his schemes had been able to gain control of all of Venice. He had the special rubber outfit he was wearing be made to allow being in that moment inside the cathedral without risking being infected with Purple Haze's virus. To tell the truth, it wasn't in his character nor his habits to be on the front line wearing something so cumbersome and uncomfortable as that. He would have preferred to listen afterwards to the report from his men, waiting leisurely in his villa by the sea, sat with a good glass of wine in hand. But this time the enemy was too strong enough to have defeated Rigatoni, the legendary stand killer. He'd done well by being there in person. It wouldn't have been bad to enjoy their end. Buccellati and Giorno transferred Naranci and Abacchio, still unconscious, into the Turtle. Even Mista, aching from the hit received during the duel against Public Image Limited, made his entrance, and Trish followed him. Then Buccellati and Giorno entered the basilica, which appeared silent and deserted. The silence was such that one could have heard a pin fall to the ground. Looking around with circumspection, they advanced slowly in that silence. After a while, they found themselves in front of a huge door that gave access to a chapel. The two companions placed their hands on the door and exchanged a knowing look. 1, 2, 3! When they threw open the door at 3, what they saw was a show too horrific to seem real. People over people. Heaps of corpses amassed over each other. Bodies with blackish faces, arms and legs bent in unnatural directions, scattered here and there to the sides of the passage. Were they tourists or believers? The floor was covered by a black liquid as viscous as tar, and there wasn't any spot where you could place your feet without risking dipping them in it. From that mountain of bodies rose a lament that resounded in the chapel like a sick and deformed litany in an unknown language. They were the sobs, the screams, the laments of the people piled up on top of each other. What? Buccellati and Giorno looked at each other. Purple Haze's power is truly terrifying, said Giorno. Buccellati shook his head. Indeed, it seems like Purple Haze's virus. But he had no way to finish his sentence. A monstrous cry echoed around them, followed by the dull sound of heavy steps approaching. What they saw, raising their eyes, was an enormous white monster that stood out against the golden light of the church. Here, finally, our guests for tonight have arrived, exclaimed Sogliola with a sneer. To Fugo, who observed at his side, that sneer appeared only as a distortion of his features under the rubber outfit. Let us see how they'll manage now. What the hell? Buccellati didn't have the time to open his mouth before the monster disappeared. The next instant, the boy was flying away with force against the lateral wall. It's extremely fast! Exclaimed Giorno, surprised. That huge monster surpassed the 20-metre distance in a single instant and struck down Buccellati. Buccellati was about to crash against one of the columns that supported the vault when, desperately trying to regain control of his flying body, he called, Sticky fingers! A moment just before the impact, his stand bolted towards the column and applied a zipper that opened, letting him pass through the stone. He avoided crashing against it, but he couldn't avoid the impact with the floor. As if mocking him, the cure hurled towards him again. There were claw scratches coming relentlessly from every angle. Buccellati attempted avoiding them by rolling over right and left. Every time the claws hit the floor, stone shards from the mosaic sprang out into the air, hitting him in his face and littering it with small wounds. The boy continued to dodge those attacks with all his strength, but the virus that the cure's body kept spreading incessantly had made contact with him and began to make its effects felt. The cure's claws were able to graze him in the abdomen. Buccellati felt the tips of his fingers go numb, and immediately after a shadow clouding his eyes. He also felt the scorching heat of his own breath. That tenacious attack that didn't even give him the time to take a breath had backed him into a corner in the end. In the meantime, Giorno had noticed a small shadow on the monster's back. What could it be? He asked himself, observing better that sort of stain that resembled a human shape. Well, the cure attacked Buccellati, an abrupt movement raised her arms, and eventually the tiny shadow slipped down. It's a person! A girl! Giorno rushed to her help. The girl was still unconscious, but, except for the bump she got by falling, she didn't seem to have suffered any other damage. Hey! Wake up! Exclaimed Giorno, tapping her 2-3 times on the cheek. The hair, damp with sweat, moved. Then the girl suddenly opened her eyes and sat up. Where am I? She asked herself, and widened her eyes at the sight of the boy in front of her. Everything's all right. You fainted, Giorno gently replied. But who are... The girl didn't have the time to finish her question before a huge white shadow darted to her side. The cure's paw hit Giorno's side and brought him upwards. Ah! His body was squeezed in a very strong hold. No! Stop it! Cried Coniglio. The creature completely disregarded her, and the gigantic paw continued with its attack. The old man laughed inside his rubber coveralls. All of his body was shaking, as if he had convulsions. Such was his delight. There, did you see? Sogliola and Fugo were on a balcony overhanging the second floor of the cathedral. From that position, one could perfectly see the central nave, and could enjoy in complete safety the outcome of the battle between Buccellati, Giorno, and the cure. If necessary, to see better, Sogliola did not fail to lean out dangerously from the parapet. He's like a kid with a new toy that has just been bought, thought Fugo. The outcome of the fight seemed already decided. Buccellati, because of the cure's violent attack and the effect of Purple Haze's virus, almost couldn't lift himself from the floor. For his part, Giorno couldn't even breathe due to the furious attacks of the berserk stand. The match might have already been concluded. Go! Go! Completely rapt by the show, Sogliola violently clapped with both his hands on the railing. He resembled a race fanatic spurring the horse on which he'd bet on. Perhaps for him, this was really nothing more than a game. This time, however, the stakes were human lives. Suddenly, a small explosion of some type was heard. Sogliola looked at his hands. Oh no, a hole! It really was a hole, a very tiny hole in that sturdy rubber get-up, which risked becoming a huge problem for Sogliola. The suit was the only protection he had in that atmosphere, saturated with a highly contagious virus. In an attempt at plugging it, he started to stretch the rubber here and there. In distress though, each time he stroked that spot, the hole ended up getting a little bit bigger. Mr. Sogliola, what happened? Seeing him getting so agitated, Fugo struggled to hold back his laughter. Sogliola didn't even bother replying, but continued to fidget and squirm inside the coveralls. Maybe he was copiously sweating, since it started to be heard the slimy sound of wet rubber sliding over a body. Having completely lost his cool, vexed and at the peak of despair, Sogliola threw away the protective mask from his face to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Mr. Sogliola, your mask! Almost without realising it, he'd thrown away the mask he'd bought to protect himself from the virus by his own volition. Ah! Sogliola was already panicking. Fugo, to calm him, placed a hand on his shoulder, but the old man continued to yell and hastily threw away the boy's hand with his own. Hey you! What was that for? Immediately, Fugo's voice sounded full of anger. Noticing the danger, Sogliola appeared to momentarily recover his composure. One should never let that boy get angry, at any cost. Sorry, it's all right. By now the match is won. I don't have anything else to do here. I'll leave you alone to finish the job. I'll go. Fugo followed with his eyes Sogliola's figure that hastily left the observation post to flee through an emergency exit. Then, after having tossed a look at the ongoing situation, he muttered, I really don't think it'll be that easy. On the contrary, Mr. Sogliola. Afterwards, he disappeared again in the night shadows. From the emergency exit, you'd pass through a suspended passageway that led to an antechamber. The cool wind that blew from the sea was really pleasant. It felt like being alive again, finally. In the anteroom, his men were waiting for him with everything he needed to get changed. That unhappy rubber outfit gave him the sensation of it being stuck to his body, as if it were made of jelly, and it reminded him about that horrid right monster that disgusted him. At the thought of being able to change his clothes, Sogliola's steps got faster. The antechamber wasn't just a simple empty room. It was designed to be used by other prelates, many of which were forced to have ties with the organisation, which obtained from them a series of advantages even higher than those derived from the management of gambling. The room was furnished with a few pieces of furniture, a table, and a bed with a rather sober look. Maybe it was a reflection of the bishop's personality, but there really was only the bare minimum. He didn't find the men that should have been there waiting for him, but all Sogliola thought about it was, stupid pieces of shit, they never miss an opportunity to slack off. He just needed to have, right there and then, the necessary clothes. The rest came later. As soon as he entered, he undressed himself and threw away the rubber outfit. He made a cursory examination on his whole body, and thought to have not been affected. Everything's good, he exclaimed, relieved, patting himself here and there to be sure. The city of Venice was still enveloped in darkness, but it would be by now, only for a few hours more. That whole story ended up dragging in a large number of citizens, but that didn't seem to matter much to Sogliola. And like that, finally, goodbye to Venice, he thought. Since he successfully carried out a direct order from the boss, he was certain a promotion in rank would have been expected. He would have bid forever goodbye to this city in which he had nothing but unpleasant memories to leave behind, and he would have moved to some place else in the peninsula. Surely a place of a much bigger business. Torino, maybe, or Milano. He knew that for those of the organisation there were excellent possibilities of doing business even in Trieste. Roma was rather unlikely, but if he could have moved into the capital. At that thought, Sogliola felt himself wanting to burst out laughing from satisfaction. A little boy was crying in a dirty alley. He'd probably been beaten. His face was full of bruises, and on his knee he had a cut from which blood copiously poured to the ground. That little boy was Sogliola. He thought again about the days of his childhood, where the everyday routine had just been suffering a series of teasings and abuses. He never forgot what he had to endure. One day I'll show those bastards who I am. I'll make them kneel at my feet. At the thought of the neighbourhood's bullies prostrated at his feet, he was able to endure anything. Now I can only dream of it, but one day, surely, one day That had been the incentive that gave him the drive to reach the position in which he was at now. For that reason he joined a gang. He'd ousted the companions that didn't suit him, and sometimes he got his hands dirty in order to reach a higher position. Always with that motive in his mind. Because of that, he underwent the arrow's trial of his own accord. One day I'll be the leader. Only then, when from the apex I see the whole world at my feet, I'll feel rewarded for all the suffering I had to endure. He was completely sure of it. Finally, the much-longed-for moment had come. Sogliola got shaken again by a fit of laughter. Actually, he never reached a real summit, but he'd managed to obtain power and money in vaster amounts than he'd ever expected. He didn't need to stay stuck in Venice. He didn't need to go around terrorising his brainless minions anymore. And then, before long, he could have retired from the scene, bought a villa facing the Mediterranean, and lived the rest of his days in peace. Tonight, at home, I'll open a bottle of the good stuff to celebrate, he thought, removing the tracksuit he had worn under the rubber coverall. He was about to grab the suit that had been prepared for him from the bed, when his hand suddenly stopped. There was something black on the neatly folded suit. It was a spider. A black spider, roughly as big as a lighter. It serenely strolled on the suit, moving its 8 hairy legs. "Who let this gross thing inside? It ruins my suit!" He turned his gaze around the room, but didn't see anyone. Damn them. How is it possible that there's no one here?" he yelled at last, shooting hateful glares at the spider. 2 men finally appeared on the threshold. "What's happening?" asked the younger of the 2. "What a bunch of good-for-nothings. Look at that on my suit! Don't you see what kind of huge spider has placed itself on it? Pieces of shit. I was in 7th heaven, and you let everything go to—" When he turned towards the 2 men and saw their faces, words died in his throat. It was Giorno and Buccellati. He saw them both at the mercy of that monstrous rabbit just prior. So why were they here now? "I don't think there's anything that surprising," said Buccellati with a serious expression. "Why, my plan was perfect. How did you survive the virus?" Giorno and Buccellati, at that question, exchanged a look and smiled. "Perfection doesn't exist," replied Buccellati, getting a step closer to Sogliola. "You thought about killing us with Purple Haze's virus, but things didn't exactly go as you planned. Well, up until the idea of amplifying the virus's power using that girl, the plan wasn't bad, but—" It was Giorno who continued. "Fugo probably forgot to tell you an important thing." "A thing? What thing?" "On me," continued Giorno. "Purple Haze's virus has no effect." "What?" Caught completely off guard, Sogliola couldn't manage to say anything else. Giorno already had to deal with Purple Haze's virus near the ruins of Pompeii City when he had gone there to retrieve the key needed to access the turtle. It had happened near a place called the House of the Tragic Poet. When Abacchio, Fugo and Giorno went there, they were attacked by Illuso, one of the organisation's traitors. Illuso's stand, man in the mirror, had successfully put them in serious trouble with its ability of freely traversing between the real world and the one reflected in mirrors. Inside that surreal space, only objects or people authorised by Illuso could get in. Fallen in his trap, the three companions ended up being separated from one another, and worse even, from their own stands, to be left at the mercy of man in the mirror. It was then that Purple Haze went out of control. Away from the one who led it, it had started to spread the virus without making any discrimination between friends and enemies. To avoid the infection, Illuso had escaped inside the mirror. Giorno had followed him after willingly infecting himself. That way Illuso had been forced to return again to the real world, where, however, Purple Haze was waiting for him. How had Giorno managed to survive? When he infected himself with the virus, he'd used the power of his stand gold experience to transform a brick into a snake. The snake, born in a place already plagued with the virus, was immune to it because it was already part of its metabolism. Using its blood to extract a serum capable of defeating the virus was all it took. Giorno was literally vaccinated against that lethal threat. Thanks to his calculated actions, Giorno had not only managed to save his own life, but also successfully accomplished the mission. Obviously, Sogliola could not know this. He'd taken for granted the fact that Purple Haze had the reputation of being endowed with an invincible virus. He certainly couldn't imagine that someone was able to defeat it. Purple Haze's virus can't do anything to me. I already have the antibodies. Fugo must have taken part in this plan with this in mind. At Giorno's words, Sogliola almost seemed to forget to breathe. Why? I'm smarter than all these brats. I'm smarter than all of them put together. How is this possible? In practice, Fugo remained in a position where, while it allowed him to not betray the organisation, it also permitted him to not betray us either. Buccellati made a gesture of his head as if to say he agreed with Giorno, then added, Apparently you must have been rather unpleasant towards him. Fugo didn't betray us, nor the organisation, but he betrayed you. Buccellati's words hit Sogliola like a blow to the head. He betrayed me? Me, really? That brat? He asked himself, looking at his hands. Everything seemed to be going so smoothly. Everything. It was then that Sogliola lifted his gaze towards them, exclaiming with rage. Don't think you've won the match! He placed his left hand on his own chest and the right had lightly brushed the bed. An instant later he'd vanished, while the bed had taken his place, erected in a vertical position. Giorno and Buccellati threw themselves to the sides to dodge the bed that was falling over them. What? The bed loudly fell to the ground, revealing beyond it Sogliola, crouched to the floor with a haughty smile. It appeared that all the surprise of earlier had disappeared to give place to an apparent confidence. I admit that my plan has been a failure, he hissed with a sneer, the face filled with wrinkles even more menacing. But I won't be stupid enough to let myself get killed by a pair of little assholes such as you! The instant in which he finished that sentence, Sogliola had vanished again. What the hell is happening? Shouted Buccellati, looking around. Giorno had rushed to the exact spot in which Sogliola had been just before, and was carefully examining the ground. He's underneath! He must be already underneath, Buccellati! He exclaimed. Before he could even finish the sentence, Buccellati had already hurried out the door. Giorno quickly followed him. The bastard's able to swap the positions of objects! Yelled Giorno towards Buccellati, who was running ahead of him. In the canal, he switched the polystyrene with the mines. It must be that, agreed Buccellati without slowing down. This means that, attempting to catch him while he sees us, the chances that he'll manage to escape are many. And saying this, he stopped. Ugly sons of bitches! Damn them! Throwing a long list of insults, Sogliola hurried towards the exit on the back of the basilica. Using on himself the power of his stand, Joy Division, which allowed him to swap the positions of what he touched, he'd been able to remove himself from a critical situation. He changed his position with that of the ground and had escaped from the floor below. It was a system he'd often used when he was still a little street lout. He never thought he'd still need it in this kind of situation. Shit! I failed in the most pitiful of ways, but I have no intention of dying right here at the hands of them. The most important thing now is to flee somewhere safe. While he got past the various cloisters and ventured towards the back of the church, Sogliola's features were beaded with sweat. I'm too old for running long distances, he thought, and finally interrupted the sprint, breathing a sigh of relief. Not much further by now. At the end of this corridor is the exit. He still couldn't consider himself safe, but the distance he'd put between him and the enemy should have been enough. Thinking so, he raised his face. At the end of the corridor, in front of the wide-open exit door, there was someone. Maybe it was one of his men. No, it wasn't one of them. The one waiting for him at the exit was Mista, one of Buccellati's companions. He really had the threatening appearance he'd seen in his card file. Rather, worse. Between the devil and the deep blue sea, he thought. The following instant, he heard the whistle of a bullet flying near his left ear. What? As a reflex, he placed his hand on it and felt it throbbing. First of all, introductions! Exclaimed Mista, pointing the gun again at him. A second shot, then a third. One after the other, the bullets flew hissing dangerously near Sogliola. Come and get me, said Sogliola to himself, throwing himself against the wall and preparing to use his joy division again. Now, Buccellati! What? Taken by surprise, Sogliola hesitated, and it was then that it happened. Sticky fingers! At that call, a weird breach opened under his feet. It was Buccellati that, hidden underground, had used Sticky Fingers' ability to create a hole in the floor. Sogliola lost his balance and was about to fall in, when he noticed some sort of rope dangling right above his head. If I hold on to that... He gathered all his strength to jump towards that rope. While he did, he had the clear impression the rope had stretched in his hand's direction. No, it hadn't been a trick of the eye. What he'd thought to be a rope had actually been the green branch of a climbing plant, one that had been given life by the power of Giorno's gold experience. While Sogliola extended his hand, in no time the plant had stretched until it reached the height of his arm, and moving as a tentacle had started to wrap around him, after which it had started to squeeze him with force. Sogliola looked under his feet. The hole opened by Sticky Fingers was waiting for him, like a huge gaping mouth. I'm trapped! Like this, hanging in midair. He certainly couldn't exchange that vine with something else using Joy Division. While he was bitterly regretting having been so reckless, the creeper continued to grow along his back, then around his neck, until it gradually covered his face. Not only that, the green buds that sprouted along the stem had started to swell, opening in an explosion of little flowers that in a second were already rivet. And then again, other buds. That vine moved and grew at an incredible speed, as in one of those documentaries where it's possible to see plants grow at high speed thanks to a special type of shooting. Eventually, an unpleasant sound of broken bones could be heard coming from his arm. I don't like your system of dragging innocent people. I don't like it one bit. I'd be really curious to know how you plan to pay your debts. But, said Buccellati, who'd appeared out of nowhere, getting closer. Alongside him were Giorno and Mista as well. Sogliola would have liked to ask for mercy, but the plant that covered his throat was squeezing too tight and impeded him from speaking, and his supplications transformed into grotesque gurgling. He watched Buccellati's right hand pointing right towards him. At the sight of the figure that stood behind that, he suddenly turned pale. In that moment, he fervently wished he'd never been a stand user. In the exact moment in which he'd seen Sticky Fingers, he understood what destiny awaited him. What was prepared for him was nothing short of death. He felt an indescribable dread raise up his throat. If only I'd never been a stand user. If only I'd never been one in my life. It was all he could think about, and he repeated it to himself indefinitely at this point. Until, by constantly doing it, something in him started to burn like a flame without light that sent sparks in every direction. No. It's exactly because I'm a stand user that maybe I can survive! Joy Division! With a surprising strength for a man his age, Sogliola evoked his stand. It was the frightening force that only a man in the face of death is able to bring out. Sogliola's hands, released from the plant that had coiled tightly around him, extended towards Buccellati. If I could exchange my position with him. If only I could change. In the instant in which Joy Division's hand was about to brush against Buccellati, the sound of something that cut through the air echoed all around. It had been a matter of a split second. Sticky Fingers' fist had been so quick, not even Sogliola had seen it, despite being a stand user as well. The first punch was flung at his right eye. A second, then a third, a fourth, a series of punches so fast as being visible to the naked eye started to pour down in rapid succession on Sogliola's face. Everything happened so quickly that the man didn't even have the perception of how his face was being reduced to a mere pulp of flesh and blood. Sticky Fingers continued to hail down its flurry of punches. Sogliola, unable to put to use his Joy Division, remained there suffering like a boxer's wretched punch bag. Arrivederci. The piercing wail of Sogliola that originated from behind the Basilica di San Marco didn't go on for long. In that same exact moment, a gondola left the River degli Schiavoni, aiming towards the open sea. On board there was a boy with blonde hair. On the tip of the boat hung a small lamp which illuminated the sea, still black in the night. From one of the cathedral's balconies, Giorno and Buccellati were following it with their gazes. Going away towards the open sea, that little light appeared tragically lonely. Addio, Panacotta Fugo, muttered Giorno, and already the little light began to lose itself in the distance and blend with the darkness. Interludio 2. Panacotta. The seabirds had started to fly. While he let himself be carried on that gondola, dawn was already around the corner. By now the sun was about to peek out on the horizon, beyond that smooth, dead calm sea. The scent of dried salt pleasantly tantalized him. Fugo was far from the coast at this point. He spat the mint leaf he was chewing into the water and filled his lungs with the fresh morning air. It had been that old and close to the ground man who had planned everything. It had been him, too, who chose that girl, who had the power to absorb the pain and suffering of others, to make her the key element of the entire cruel project. Sogliola, over the years, had compiled a list of all the stand users in Venice, and had chosen the girl's name, picking it among those in a thick card index. He even foresaw that her stand would absorb and strengthen Purple Haze's virus, then inevitably spread it all over Venice. It would even drag in tourists and common citizens that didn't have anything to do with the organisation. When he'd been informed about that plan, Fugo had been deeply repulsed by it. Obviously, from the moment he'd left Buccellati and his companions to return to working for the organisation, he very well knew he had to obey the Capi's orders. The organisation punished those who didn't respect the rules with death, eliminating the comrades with whom he'd fought together until that day with his own hands. He imagined the condition would have been that. They would have never welcomed back, without some proof of loyalty, the lost sheep that shortly before had defected alongside a group of traitors. The organisation had strict rules. But there was one thing he really couldn't stomach. He didn't approve that to reach his goal, in this case to kill traitors, any means could be justifiable. That one could, ultimately, take the liberty of dragging in even people who had nothing to do with this. In front of Sogliola, who merely explained the plan, Fugo had become aware of some important factors. First of all, Purple Haze's virus was in no way invincible. Moreover, the stand power of the girl called Coniglio had not yet fully matured. He'd put together the various elements that would come to be part of his plan, and had done a very rapid evaluation. Then he added the fact that Giorno had already been vaccinated against the virus. Thanks to him, it could have worked out. As a final result, his behaviour could have appeared as a betrayal towards the organisation. Yet he really hadn't been able to forgive that old man who cheerfully planned a mass extermination. He had to come up with a system to stop the plan. A system that could have even represented some sort of parting gift for his friends of before. He closed his eyes before the dazzling reflections of the rays of the sun which had slowly shown itself on the horizon. Behind his lids played, as if on a movie screen, the events of the past hours. Then they vanished bit by bit. He asked himself if that girl would have been able to overcome the awful experience, and he asked himself if Buccellati and the others would ever be able to reach the boss, somehow. "Yes, they surely will," he exclaimed out loud. Especially because Giorno was with them, with his presence of mind. With someone like him, capable of uniting together the individual elements of Buccellati's group, always on the verge of coming apart at the seams, it wouldn't have been possible. He was sure of it by now. He didn't regret having left Buccellati's group. Fugo had made the choice which in that moment he believed to be more right. He was sure even his ex-companions would have been able to understand, and wouldn't have blamed him. Decisions can be made and changed at any given moment. At first, a race to reach a goal can be different, but sooner or later, the right opportunity surely comes. Fugo, vehemently dragged back and forth between a bestial nature and a superior intellect, noticed for the first time something that went beyond his condition. Something that went beyond the rationality and the violence, and indicated the goal to follow. It was about the courage of choosing only one answer at a time, in the midst of the infinite number of those that fate offers daily to each living being who treads the ground of this world. Capitolo 8. Giovanna. Some time after the unfolding of these events, a new urban legend was born. La Chiesa in mezzo alla steppa was a tale that had a decent success upon ethnology students. The story was approximately the following. It took place in a sort of steppe. A young guy, returning from a friend's house, ended up getting lost in that desolate barren land. The boy wandered between rocks and scrub without even finding a place to rest. He roamed and roamed restlessly until, having even exhausted all his tears, at the limit of fatigue he collapsed exhausted. It was then that suddenly a maiden appeared. It was a young and beautiful girl, who woke up the boy and led him to a nearby shack. At first sight it really resembled a hovel, but on the roof there was a little bell, and around the house a garden. In the garden hopped a little rabbit, as white as snow. Il piccolo paradiso, many called it so. In the shack the boy had been given a soup of water and salt, in addition to stale bread, and had been encouraged to rest. After that, the girl had called the rabbit that was in the garden, had made it curl up in her lap, and had asked the boy if he was wounded. As soon as the boy had pointed the aching spot, the girl had delicately massaged it, and the pain began to decrease until it disappeared as if by magic. Then the girl had asked if he didn't have anything that troubled him. He'd started to talk about it, and, while he spoke, he noticed that maybe it wasn't really such a serious thing. Before long the boy felt incredibly well and had laid down in that shack's bed to fall asleep. When he'd reopened his eyes, however, he'd found himself on a bench near his home, and had started to think it had all been a dream. According to the many versions, the story could be set in a desert, or on an isolated island in the middle of the sea, or variations of the same kind. In the same way, even the age and profession of the protagonist changed. Despite being rare, it could happen that in place of the male protagonist there was a female protagonist, but the basic structure remained unaltered in every version. There always was someone that got lost, and got his wounds and troubles healed inside the house of a girl who brought with her a white rabbit, and that then this someone mysteriously found themselves home after a night's sleep. It was said that that legend had been born from the innate wish to be comforted, that it was a metaphor portraying the desire of returning to nature, and many silly explanations circulated about the origin of this tale. The only certain thing is that for a certain period of time it was liked and was trendy, but after some years it stopped being told even in cultural institutes, until it was forgotten. Actually, it was neither a fictional tale nor an urban legend. It was Coniglio's story after that awful adventure. When Coniglio had reopened her eyes in the Basilica di San Marco, and the boy in front of her had been grasped by that huge white monster which slammed him around, she hadn't been able to believe the scene before her eyes. She'd shaken her head as if to wake up. Then, suddenly, behind the boy's back, had appeared the figure of a man shining with a golden light. It wasn't correct to define that being as a man. Of a man it had the appearance, yes, but its movements were much more agile. As soon as it appeared, it attacked the huge white monster with a staggering speed. It was in that moment that Coniglio had become aware of it. The white and huge creature, that monster so big it seemed to reach the cathedral ceiling, was none other than the Cure, the tiny rabbit that had been with her since she was a child, grown excessively. The golden man had hit it hard plenty of times, but the Cure's huge body didn't seem to suffer any effect. It was the same as when you poke with a finger a balloon full of water. In fact, the Cure absorbed in its body even the damage directly inflicted to it, and so continued to grow. The more it got attacked, indeed, the more its body became larger by the minute. It had happened right at the instant she became aware of the situation. The boy that the Cure squeezed, suddenly, had given a yell. "Buccellati! The girl's in danger! Try to protect her!" Coniglio had turned towards the direction in which the boy had seemed to make his plea, and had seen another young guy. He had his hair cut into a straight bob, styled in a weird way, and dressed in a white suit, decorated with flashy zippers. His suit was shredded at this point. Furthermore, he displayed those familiar symptoms. The right arm was swollen and livid, between blue and black. The virus must have already been in his bloodstream, and continued to multiply with devastating effects. Yet the boy didn't back down. With incredible endurance, he had moved towards Coniglio. "Are you okay? You aren't wounded?" he'd asked with kindness, even if, actually, he appeared about to fall apart at any moment. Coniglio had felt herself gripped by doubt. "Do you want this story to repeat itself once more? Here, too?" Suddenly, she recalled a voice from the depths of her mind. "You must save them. You have the power to save them." It was the voice of that boy. In the dark she'd recalled those eyes, in some way veiled with sadness. "Yes, it's true. I can help them." "The Cure!" The girl's voice had loudly echoed in the whole cathedral. Suddenly, the Cure had stopped attacking Giorno. It had tilted its head to the side as if trying to better hear the sound of the dear voice that had last called out for it quite some time ago. "The Cure! I need your help! I beg you! Return to what you used to be!" As soon as Coniglio had finished shouting those words, from the Cure's body had begun to blow a very strong wind that brought with itself a rain of soft fur that reached up to the height of the cathedral's arches. For a second its fur appeared to shine hair by hair. Then its brilliance faded. Giorno, who'd held onto a column as to not let himself be blown away by the wind, had heaved a huge sigh of relief. He looked in the midst of that mountain of fur, fluffily falling towards the ground as if it were snow, searching with his eyes the spot in which, until shortly before, was the Cure. Yet here there wasn't any monster. In its place, on the lap of the girl hunkered on the floor, was curled up a tiny white creature with huge ears, which seemed completely at ease, as if that had always been the only place where it wanted to be. The light blue precious stones it had on the tip of its ears twinkled like stars in the night. In that moment, Buccellati was watching the rain of white fur that was falling from above. The arm that just before was horribly swollen and deformed because of the virus had returned back to normal, as if nothing had ever happened. Already 2 months have passed since I came to this place. It's almost time for me to think about the next destination. She was in the USA, in Illinois, in a small village, so small it wasn't even marked on maps. It was a place a bit far from the highway, in an area still rich with greenery. All around there were only fields stretching to the horizon. Heaving a deep sigh, her lungs filled with the pleasant smell of sun-dried grass. From somewhere could be heard the engine of a distant tractor. "There's no place more wonderful than this, out of all those I've lived in until today," Coniglio was thinking, from the depths of her heart. After the events of Venezia, first of all, she left for the USA. Saying that she wasn't worried at all about her mother, who she'd left behind in Rome, would have been a lie, but but at the moment she was completely preoccupied by the horrible things that had happened. She wanted to atone. It was the only thing that for her, now, had absolute precedence. The day after newspapers had reported the case in block letters, questioning if it had been a new indiscriminate terrorist attack. After that, they'd published a list of the over 100 victims that had gotten involved. They were the people she tried to save, but whose life had slipped away anyway. Her friend and colleague Renona, the little child that lost her life at the hospital, and all the people she saw on the ground that night in the city. She could have helped them, and hadn't been able to. No form of repentance would have ever been enough. What had happened had taught her an important lesson. If I can do something, I must do it in the best way possible. I have the gift of healing people from injury and suffering, and now I've decided to start using it seriously. Of course, her power wasn't limitless. For this reason, she had been able to fully prevent the tragedy in Venice, since she didn't know enough about her powers and had never done anything to know them. She had to pay for the mistakes she'd made, and would have used her whole life to settle that bill. To atone for this, she immediately left for a foreign country. I'll use my power on people that don't know anything about me. I don't know what will happen. Maybe it'll be a failure, or maybe everything will go well. Either way, it will be okay like this. I've decided to stop living in fear of discovering myself. When, during her journey, unpleasant experiences happened to her, there were always some words that came back to her. I know you've suffered a lot for the things that happened, but even if everything was caused by one of our companions, listen to my words, please. It's not possible to save everyone. The choices you can make are infinite, and the world is too complex. Neither you nor I can know which choice is right and which is wrong, had said the boy inside San Marco's cathedral, all in a single breath. Then he'd looked her right in the eye, as if to say, you understand, right? And had added, whatever might be the terrible consequence you face, the fact of choosing something and accepting its consequences is the most important thing. Maybe I'm the one being mistaken, but... He was a strange boy, and on his clothes he pinned big brooches in the shape of ladybugs. His gaze was clear, and that meant he was speaking from the heart. It was as if he emanated some sort of golden light. A clear ray of golden light, able to reach even the deepest part of her soul. The proud blood that flowed for generations in the veins of the Joestar family's members, from which that boy descended through unexpected ramifications lost to time, flowed without a doubt in his as well, and that beautiful light had left a mark on Coniglio's heart. The girl would have never noticed had she never met him. In her veins, too, began to pulse some of that golden light, and from that moment on, it would do so forever. The blood could be shared, and could give life to a new light. We did choose the path of fight, and I'm not ashamed of it. I hope it's the same for you. I truly hope so. With those words, the boy left the church behind, together with his companion, and began to walk towards the final battle. The girl, looking at their retreating figures, had perceived the heroic strength of their resolve, and was filled with more respect for them than she'd ever felt for anyone before. The path of their struggle, perhaps, was lit by that golden light. A last thought crossed her mind. As they're going to fight their battle, then I too, have decided to fight mine.